again, Pamela. It's always a joy to be on your program, and I'm looking forward today to speaking about this book and website that I've just released. The book is called The Gospel of Aquarius, Jesus and the Logos of the Universal Christ. And the website is gospelaquarius.com. And the entire content of the book is also on the website. And the reason for that is because I want to have this content available to the world, to people in the world who are seeking, and especially Christians. We know that the teachings of the Ascended Masters give us the Gospel of Aquarius, the good news that Jesus brought in a more developed form, and we received a lot more insight on the life and teachings of Jesus through the work that was brought forth through Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and even before that through the Bridge to Freedom and the I Am movement. And so then what happened was that I was guided a few months ago to start looking at the Gnostic Gospels, and I had had it on my heart for years that I would eventually write about this and use the Gnostic Gospels as one of the fundamental pillars of this writing. And this Gnostic book was looking at me for a long time until I finally decided now is the time. And it's time to look into this and write about this. So I did a lot of reading. I reread all of the Gospels and the Bible first, and then I went into all of the Gnostic texts and went back to the teachings of the Ascended Masters, and a beautiful alchemy came forward. Before I talk more about this alchemy that's in this book, I would like to preface it by explaining that I was raised Catholic and Christian, both. And so I was taught about Jesus from a very young age. And I loved, as a little child, hearing and reading the stories of Jesus. And I really enjoyed catechism and all of that early on. But then as I grew older, I knew there were things that were missing. Things just didn't quite make sense. Things didn't make sense in some ways for me. And I also became interested in other faiths. I couldn't see why God would only be talking to Christians, and why the other faiths of the world that also love God wouldn't have a path or a key to the kingdom. So I started studying other faiths as well. I studied everything from the Sufi side of Islam to the Buddhism and Hinduism and various New Age teachings, looked into Zoroastrianism, and did a class on comparative religion at college, and really tried to understand what this was all about. I was also, from a very young age, very much smitten, you could say, by the ancient Greek and Egyptian history. I love the Greek heroes and heroines and the gods and goddesses. In fact, when I was 11 years old, I was in school and I did an enormous, like, 1 hour presentation on all the Greek gods and goddesses, and I knew them all better than I do today. And I knew all of their relationships, and loved Pallas Athena, that we know as a lady master, goddess of truth. And so this was all fundamental preparation, I think, that went on my whole life to get to that place where I could write this book, put it together, which took a tremendous amount of research and also a tremendous amount of mental stamina to put this forward, and communion with Christ. I definitely felt the overshadowing of my beloved Holy Christ self with me, and the various masters or angels who would be working with me through this work, because there were insights that would come forth, and all of a sudden clarity would emerge on certain scriptures or passages that I hadn't completely understood before. I also did look at various translations of the Bible to get a better understanding. And I would go back to the teachings of my beloved teacher, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, to see what she would say on certain passages. And I often found that we would come to the same understanding or conclusion, which I believe happens through the Holy Spirit. So anyway, so that was kind of my background. I knew it was really important to put forth a bridge between the Christian understanding of Jesus and the Aquarian understanding, the Aquarian age understanding of Christ. We've entered the age of Aquarius. We were in Pisces for 2,000 years, and though many saints walk the path home to God in the Piscean age, a lot of souls were also left behind because of a dogma that is just too rigid and incomplete. It's just incomplete. And I always felt like religion, spirituality should make sense, that you can't just go on blind faith. I always believed it was like science, religion and science going together. And so if something really didn't make sense, the Christian Catholic dispensation says, well, it's just a mystery. We don't try to understand the mysteries. And I do believe there's some validity to that. There are levels of mystery that we are intended to, that let's just say unveil themselves to us over time, and we're eventually intended to comprehend. But for the most part, I believe that God, as our loving Father, Mother, as our inspiration and refuge, wants us to understand what this was all about. Jesus wanted us to understand. In fact, one of Jesus's favorite sayings is, let those who have ears hear, right? And one of the things that my mom recently reminded me of again was, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be open to you. And I thought, it's time for this awareness to come forth. So when I look at the book, I'll just explain to you a little bit what we have here. We started out with understanding or looking at the childhood of Mary. Mother Mary, as a child, was trained and received very special spiritual training to become the mother of Christ. And Mother Mary, we know from the teachings, had three previous embodiments, well, two previous embodiments. This was her third embodiment, where she was the mother of Christ, Jesus. She had been the mother of King David, who was also an embodiment of Jesus. And before that, she had been a Vestal Virgin on Atlantis in the Temple of Truth. So she had experience with all that and with holding the Immaculate Conception and concept. And she was raised by angels in the temple, and she literally went at age 3 into the temple. And so, she came from a very, very holy, devout Essene family. They were extraordinarily devout, and the conception and birth of Mary was also quite miraculous. And so then, we understand how these various ancient manuscripts tell us a lot more about this whole time period. And then we move into her betrothal to Joseph, and then we move into the birth of Christ. And so I'm not going to tell you everything, because this book turned out to be 800 pages long. I had no idea. And if you can imagine, I was able, by the grace of God, to write it and put it together in like 3 months' time, which is amazing to me. It really is. And it was intense. I'm not saying it wasn't intense. I felt such a strong push to get this forth. It was like giving birth to octuplets or something. I was just like, there are 13 chapters, so it's like 13 chapters. It was really intense, but it was a very beautiful labor also, that I felt absolutely compelled to do once I got into it. So anyway, so we go into the birth of Christ, and there are some very neat and beautiful little stories that were also part of the apocryphal manuscripts that are not included in the Bible. The Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas, and another Gospel of the Infancy of Jesus that may have been written by Matthew. There's one called the Pseudo Gospel. And so there's just different texts that show different stories, and whether or not these are completely accurate or not, I have no way to know for sure. But I think that when we look at all of this time period of Jesus, we're looking at people who were relaying, after the fact, and so to some degree, every story is going to reflect the person who was writing about it or telling about it, and I don't think that these other stories that were excluded from the Bible are completely meaningless. I think there's at least a kernel of truth in them, if not a lot more. So then we go into the meeting with John the Baptist in the womb, and Elizabeth, the cousin of Mary. We go into the flight to Egypt, and lots of teaching on the Egyptian rituals, the Egyptian legends of Jesus, the various stories that come forth from Egypt are very sweet and beautiful. And then we know from the teachings of the Ascended Masters that Jesus did receive training also in Egypt, in Luxor, where the retreat of the Ascension is, and the Master Serapis Bey, who would have already have been ascended at that point in time. So there's a lot there, and we have to look at the similarities between Christianity and the ancient Egyptian rite. It's quite clear that they are very similar in some ways, and there's no coincidence about these things. And so looking at that, looking at then his childhood and coming back into the Holy Land, more stories of Jesus as a little child. I think what stood out for me the most was that he was learning to use his abilities, his spiritual abilities, in a righteous way. I mean, he obviously had all of this attainment and ability, even the ability to, miracles would happen through him. His divinity would come forth through him, but he still had to learn to be disciplined, learn to use his powers in a right way, and he had to learn socialization skills. He was very different. He was definitely a different child, and people were not kind to him. In fact, I remember hearing the words in the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, which we know were dictated by Mother Mary and Archangel Raphael. There's a passage about how Jesus was so rejected. And I thought about that, how Mother Mary, as his mother, would have known how much he was rejected. And I understand that it was not just as a man, it was as a child too. He had a lot of rejection. He was a different vibration, different understanding, and everything. And so these were challenges he had to face. He was also being born in the sign of Aries. He was not born at Christmas. The Christmas birth came later as a celebration of the light of Christos coming in during the darkest time of the year, at the time of winter solstice. It also dovetails with ancient Mithraic and Egyptian ceremonies of the birth. I believe it was the birth of Horus on December 25th, and other mysteries that point to that December 25th date. And so the tradition kind of lumped it all together later, and it was to bring in that Christ light in the darkest time of the year. But Jesus, as a soul incarnate, was actually born in the spring. And so as an Aries, he had the challenges and opportunities that the sign of Aries brings, and we know Aries can be very feisty. And so Jesus had to learn to control his ego and his feistiness and his impetuousness. And he was actually given an apostle or a disciple, Peter, who had a lot of that in him as well. So anyway, we look at these childhood stories, and there were healings, there were raising of the dead, there were all kinds of miracles that happened as a child. He also, in Egypt, there were several springs that are credited to his name, springs that sprang up out of the desert where Jesus was. One actually was in a salt lake, and the freshwater spring sprung forth from Jesus, it says. So then we get through the childhood and we go to the East, because there are a number of manuscripts from the East that say Jesus went to India, and not just India, the Himalayas, Tibet, studied the Vedas, studied the various teachings of the Buddha, and the yogis, became a yogi, and had a lot of challenge once again with the Brahmin priests. We see in Jesus's life, both in Jerusalem with the Jewish priests, which were called the Sanhedrin, and with the Brahmin priests, the same situation that happens again and again, where they want him to basically go along with what they want, and they don't want him roughing the waters, but he does, because he's denouncing the caste system. He's teaching that God is within. He is doing miracles of healing. He is championing women's rights. He is championing that the sons and husbands need to respect their wives and mothers, and so he is offering a whole different form of spiritual understanding. And even though the Brahmin priests can perceive his attainment, they don't like his message. They don't like his message. They want him to go along with them and not, preach the message that he was preaching. So they try to kill him a number of times, just like the Jewish priests tried to kill him. They want to get rid of him, and that doesn't work out. So he does flee from one area to the next. And in the process, I believe he may have learned 3 to 5 different languages of ancient manuscript languages. I mean, there was, there would have been Sanskrit or Pali, probably. There was also an interesting language that was the language that the Buddhist texts were written in, that I discovered. Now I'm trying to remember the name of it. It'll probably come back to me. Kharoshthi, I think it's called. Anyway, these are all very different languages. And so you think about that, you think about Hebrew, which are letters of fire, you think about the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you think about the Greek letters, and you think about all the different alphabets that Jesus had to learn. I mean, really, to study all of these various documents and manuscripts. And so he did. And so he studied them, and as he was perfecting himself, was also doing a number of miracles. And so these Eastern manuscripts talk about that. They talk about this one who came from Israel, did all of this, and then returned back to Israel. One manuscript speaks of possibly of Mary Magdalene having followed him from the east, from Kashmir. I don't know if that is correct or not, and I didn't elaborate on that because I didn't feel guided to do that. But in my own consciousness, I'm thinking that might very well be a possibility. I also so anyway, I was looking at all of these various manuscripts. One of the manuscripts from the East that was very, very very beautiful to me was the one called The Revelation of the Magi, and that was found recently, I believe, though it might have been published in the 1700s first. So it was translated. All these manuscripts are translated from these ancient languages, and this is the manuscript where the 3 magi talk about how they follow the star and how Jesus accompanies them on their journey to see the Christ child, and they're coming from the east. So Jesus returns to the east later, and there's definitely an east-west connection in Jesus that cannot be overlooked. Even though Christendom has overlooked it for the last 2,000 years, it's time now for this to go into the flame, and for East and West to come together, and for us to understand there's only one God, and there is only one Christ and one Buddha, and they work together. And the Buddhic consciousness, the Christ consciousness, is our rightful inheritance. So in this manuscript, the three wise men explain that Christ tells them, as this Christ star or child that is coming forward, that he has incarnated before, that this is not his first appearing on earth, that he has come forth before, and that he has come again, and so they follow him, and then they return to their countries. I believe it was Persia, though it may have gone as far as India. It's not exactly clear where that land was, but they were obviously mystics, high level mystics. They perceive this in their meditations and their visions, and so anyway, it's a revelatory understanding of Jesus, not just as the carpenter child, though he did do carpentry. He actually did miracles with wood and carpentry, but going way beyond that to a boy who traveled, a young man who traveled, learned many languages, may have also gone to England with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, as well, who was selling tin, a merchant of tin in those days. And there are legends in England about that. So we see a much broader picture, and we see this broader picture emerge, and it sets the stage for the next part of Jesus's mission. Now, I took some time in the book to write about the 12 apostles, because that is very important. Understanding there's a tremendous significance to the 12 apostles and their connection to the 12 tribes of Israel, and their very specific, dharma, or their very specific mission that they incarnated to uphold with Jesus. Jesus was the center of a circle of 12. He was the 13th in the middle. And these 12 apostles had been the brothers of Joseph when Jesus was Joseph, King of Dreams. And so there was also an aspect here of a reincarnation and of a mission that was being carried out and completed. And it's fascinating and very important to understand the different roles that the apostles played. Now, I also devoted a lot of time to the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because we know from the teachings of the Ascended Masters that she is his twin flame. And so the love that they share spans all time and space, and they were incarnated before, and they are now together again. And I was just recently revisiting some teachings from Atlantis, where Jesus was actually a Golden Age Christ emperor on Atlantis, and he was in that life serving with Mary Magdalene, well, the soul of Mary Magdalene. So they were there back then also. And so I think there was a tremendous amount of condemnation on Mary Magdalene, and it's not completely clear that she was the woman caught in adultery, though it is clear that he cast out 7 devils from her. But she represents the fallen feminine that needs to be forgiven and uplifted, which is within all of us. The soul is our feminine potential of God. The Christ self is the masculine. And so to some degree, we're all Mary Magdalene. We've all fallen like Mary or like Eve, and we have come back to be redeemed for our feminine potential, our mother light to be redeemed as the raising of the Kundalini on the spinal altar, so that we can become one with Christ again and ascend. And so it's really important, I think, in this book and this work, that made it a point to take Mary Magdalene off the cross, of condemnation that she's had for the last 2,000 years. And it's interesting that she became a saint in the Catholic Church, and that they have a feast day for her, and that they've raised her up in understanding. And I think she's more and more appreciated now, not just as someone Jesus rescued, but as someone who is a companion of Jesus and a beloved of Jesus. And that becomes more clear as we move forward in the story, because when Jesus resurrected from the dead, or from the tomb, when his body took on a whole new vibrational frequency, she recognized him. She was one of the first to recognize him, if not the first. And that was because she herself was in that vibration. You can't recognize something that you're not. That's why when Peter said to Jesus, "You are the Christ," he had to be in his Christ awareness to recognize the Christ in Jesus, you know? So we look at Mary Magdalene, and then we look at some of the legends that are attributed to her afterwards. She may have gone to France, she may have returned to India. It's, you know, whatever it was, she and Jesus have stayed very much close together. And we look at her most recent life as Amy Semple McPherson, the wonderful evangelist who did so many incredible healings. Her life was really amazing, and Jesus was healing through her. And I was revisiting that life, and he gave her the understanding, and she had this vision of being the bride of Christ, and it was so personal, because she was his twin flame, and she had that awareness at the soul level. And one of the things that she really encourages people in this book, and in general as an Ascended Lady Master, is to do the violet flame. She explains how she was incarnate during the time of Godfrey and Lotus, who were the messengers of the I Am movement, and Guy Ballard and Mama Ballard. And she said they were in Los Angeles with me at the same time, and we never crossed paths. I didn't want anything to do with it, because her view of Christianity was still pretty myopic and could not include New Age understanding like the violet flame. And we have to move to integrate the violet flame into the church now. I remember Elizabeth Clare Prophet once said Catholicism is pretty much just fine if we would just add the violet flame to it, because they have the understanding of Mother Mary and the saints and many other very important fundamentals of the path, the archangels and so forth. And but without the violet flame, it's limited. And I was recently rereading how Cardinal Banzano, who was cardinal of the Catholic Church, who did make his ascension, spoke about how he was seeing the violet flame in his meditations. And so Jesus did on the inner give the violet flame to some of his saints. But if you don't have a very active awareness, understanding of the violet flame and invoke it, then it will to some degree stultify your progress, or make it so you have to reincarnate again to fulfill your mission. And so the violet flame is truly the freedom flame, the unguent of freedom that allows us to balance karma a lot more quickly. It's a seventh ray frequency and aspect of God. And Saint Germain, who was embodied as Saint Joseph, brought this awareness forward for this Aquarian age, that people would have the use of the violet flame to accelerate their return home to God. Now, one of the things that we see as we study the Gnostic Gospels is not only the closeness of Mary Magdalene and her incredible understanding of Jesus's most deep teachings, most esoteric teachings. She really understands it, and but she also, you know, they're talking about the importance of getting up into the worlds with the invisibles, and there are actually many concepts in the Gnostic teachings that I include in this book that go hand in hand with the teachings of the Ascended Masters. And so we find, for example, the one called the Nameless One. We find the 4 and 20 Elders. We find all of these different masters and beings that we have heard of in the teachings of the Ascended Masters, who are in the Gnostic Gospels from 2,000 years ago, and that were just rediscovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. So it's really, I thought it was thrilling to find all of this affirmation of the teachings of the Ascended Masters coming from a source that's 2,000 years old, and saying it's all basically the same. In fact, Jesus said in one of the Gnostic teachings says any faith that reinforces what we're teaching is one of us. Like, so Jesus is basically giving a green light to other faiths, to the teachings of the Ascended Masters, and even in some of the Gnostic teachings, Zarathustra is brought up, the Zoroastrianism, and some of the Greek mysteries like Apollo and other Greek mysteries are brought up, and just various, there's also a Gospel of the Egyptians. And so anyway, there are other faiths that are brought in and validated as that point of holiness that can help people return to God. So we talked about the 12 apostles and about Mary Magdalene. Another chapter that I dedicated in this book has to do with the very extraordinary relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist, which went back to the lifetime of Elijah and Elisha. Elisha was Jesus, the soul of Jesus, and Elijah was the soul of John the Baptist. And so we find that there's just so many similarities. It's extraordinary, and so many similar miracles. I mean, first Elijah, then Elisha, they were doing precipitation of food, whether it was oil or bread, just like the loaves and fishes later. They were raising the dead, certain people. They were healing lepers and other situations. And so we see that they were literally both doing the work that they would come back to do next. And Elijah is taken up, and Elisha then receives his mantle and goes forth with the double portion of the mantle of Elijah, and it's at the River Jordan. And so they literally come back to the River Jordan in the next life, which was about 800 years later. I was looking at it time-wise. So they come back in the same location to do the same work. And the amount of judgment and rebuking that Elijah did with the priests of Judaism, the high priests and those he called the generation of vipers, he was already doing that 800 years before. So we see this Pharisee consciousness, which in the Old Testament, was maybe not called Pharisee, but it was pretty much the same thing. This ancient Judaic tradition of hard-heartedness and stubbornness and unwillingness to receive the new dispensation, right? We see that, and their hatred, their hatred of the prophets, their hatred of anyone that would outshine them and be closer to God, and their refusal to bend the knee or obey in any way to the message of Christ within that individual. So we saw that with Elijah. We saw that with Elisha. He does the same thing. He outlives Elijah by decades and carries on the same mission. And then they both come back again, and they are both incarnate together. Now we know Elijah was most extraordinary because he was an ascended master. He was an ascended master who volunteered or agreed to come back into the physical plane. And as far as we know, he may be the only one who ever did that after earning the ascension, decided to come back again because he loved Jesus and the mission of Jesus so much, he wanted to prepare the way. And so we see them again, where John the Baptist says he must increase and I must decrease. And we see the relationship again between the two. Then John the Baptist gets beheaded, but next thing you know, he's on Transfiguration Mount with Moses, and they are speaking to Jesus from the ascended master place. I mean, if any Christians say there's no ascended masters in the Bible, well, just Transfiguration Mount is an encounter with the ascended masters. I mean, here they're encountering Moses and John the Baptist. I'm sorry, and Elijah, who was John the Baptist. So anyway, the point is that we see other places where just like Elijah, Enoch, and others were taken up. And we see the path of the ascension being demonstrated even within the Bible, though it has not been made a priority or emphasized by Christianity for obvious reasons, I think, of control and to manage the content, manage the message. The message has been so managed for the last 2,000 years. It's time to unmanage that message and bring it forth as to how it was intended to be. And I think that message is the clearest in some of the Gnostic Gospels. Now, I'm not saying the Gnostic Gospels are 100% accurate. There are some areas of thinking, excuse me, there are some areas of thinking that may be a little convoluted, but overall, there are some very, very important points that are being made that have been completely overlooked for 2,000 years, completely overlooked. There is an extraordinary description of heaven in the Gospel of Peter, extraordinary. And it's just a description of the etheric plane. And then they go into the planes of hell too, and all of that. The Gospel of Bartholomew is fabulous because it's showing how Jesus and his disciples after the resurrection had all of these mystical experiences together and went from the planes of heaven into the planes of hell, went from, seeing Jesus rising up in chariots of cherubim to having, Bartholomew, with the help of Jesus or the assistance or sponsorship of Jesus, interrogating Belial, who was a fallen angel, and learning all about the fall of the angels and so forth. So there's just a tremendous amount of very, very rich content that's been hidden for 2,000 years. And this Gospel of Aquarius that I put together by the grace of God shares it all. It shares it all. I'm not omitting anything because so much has been omitted in the past. I said, I'm putting it all out there. And so after we look at all of these relationships, we go into the teaching or the life of Jesus. We look again from the four Gospels at the life of Jesus in Galilee, healing and raising the dead and doing exorcisms and performing various miracles. And then we look at the extraordinary hatred that was leveled at him and their constant, in 3 years, constant wanting to kill him, and he disappearing from their midst again and again and again. But we see how much he was a rabble-rouser and an annoyance and an irritant to the priestly class in the various temples, Jerusalem most notably. So we see that, and we understand that they really thought he was just completely out of his mind, and that he was either demon possessed or just they could not recognize the source or the Christ in him, and they were so convinced of their righteousness even after the resurrection, after Jesus dies on the cross and is resurrected, and there's the big earthquake that happens and all of that. Some of them are still saying, that was a false teacher. You guys were following a false teacher. They tell the disciples, and they saw them as people that needed to be arrested, done away with, because they just could not understand or appreciate the light of Christ and the teaching of Christ. It was so foreign to them, and they kept going back to their allegiance to Moses. So I also noted a very interesting point, which was that according to some of the Gospels, the soldiers that actually saw the angels roll away the stone actually saw the miracles that took place, and Jesus going out of the tomb into heaven and then returning, and basically were there for the blast of resurrection flame on the shroud that was recorded on the Shroud of Turin. They go back to see Pilate. They obviously are continuously connecting with the priests to see what they're supposed to say or not say, and they're paid off. They're handsomely paid off to shut their mouth. Don't say anything. Don't say anything about what you've seen, right? And I realized as I was reading this that that's why likely a lot of Jews even till today don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah or the Son of God, because a lot of Jews at the time did not perceive the resurrection. So the followers of Jesus did, and they had to be in a high vibration to be able to perceive Jesus, because Jesus could basically materialize or dematerialize his form as needed between the etheric and the physical planes. It's like the working of a rheostat, where the vibration solidifies or etherealizes, and and that's why initially, like the two that were walking with him on the road to Emmaus could not recognize him. He had a different form. His body had been so broken by the crucifixion. His body had been so broken. I mean, he had, I don't remember, it was over 100 wounds. I mean, just the crown of thorns itself created more than 50 wounds into his skull. I mean, it wasn't just a little crown. It was a major helmet of hard as nail thorns that they pounded into his skull. And so just that, not to mention all the scourging he got with Roman, lead tips, whips and everything else. I mean, he was literally, his body was so broken that by the time he got on the cross, it took 3 hours for him to die, to pass on, to give up the ghost. And so when he resurrected that body, or his body, it took on another form. It was like a resurrected, ascended master light body, even before his ascension. And not everyone could recognize that or see it or perceive it. And he only appeared to those that he chose to appear to. He would walk in and out of doors, in and out of buildings, and so it became really a matter of faith and belief and understanding. And that was beyond the earthy. And when St. Paul talked about bodies corruptible and bodies incorruptible, this is what we're looking at. And Jesus actually appeared to St. Paul as the ascended master, and had him, converted and then become one of the greatest proponents of Christianity. So we can understand this incredible journey, and what a miracle it was that this, teaching of Jesus through the 12 apostles somehow took over the planet. I mean, what a miracle when you think about it. These apostles went one by one into all of these foreign lands, and they almost all suffered martyrdom. Even John, he lived and made his ascension there in the age of 90, but he was still put in a vat of boiling oil. And I mean, we're talking every kind of most cruel martyrdom you can have, crucified upside down, as a cross, skin removed from Bartholomew, vats of oil. I mean, they did it all in those days, and roasted on, I mean, just like the stuff was pretty bad when you look at what happened to all of the apostles. And yet they were able to, through the dispensation of the mantle upon them, which we describe in that chapter on the apostles of the 12 tribes of Israel, they were able to bring this message forth to the entire world. And by the grace of God, it took over. The only problem is that 300 years later, the Nicene Council decides to codify the teaching, and they take out so much. They take out the idea that Jesus is an elder brother. They make him the only Son of God, that no one can be like. They take out the concept of reincarnation completely. They eliminate that. And they basically set themselves up as a go-between between the people and Jesus, as opposed to having it be a mystical walk. And even with that being said, there were saints all the way through. I spent some time in the book talking about Saint Hildegard from Bingen. She was an extraordinary mystic that lived on the Rhine Valley in the 1200s, and her teachings are so Gnostic, but also so New Age, that she was recently not only canonized, but made a doctor, one of the 4 female doctors of the Catholic Church. So it's interesting that the Catholic Church was willing and able to recognize some of the teachings that she brought forth. She talks about the cosmic Christ. She creates paintings of what looks like the causal body, does extraordinary music. And so I feature her prominently in the book, as well as an understanding of how the Christian message can dovetail with the Aquarian message, that is the new age of Christ and Aquarius and Saint Germain and the violet flame. So the age of the Holy Spirit. So those are some of the features in the book. We speak about the resurrection, the ascension, Gnosticism, and then this universality of Christ, Jesus as an emissary to every religion, to every soul of light on the planet. And you don't have to give up your tradition to become a follower of Jesus. I think that's a really important message. You follow Jesus most especially through the heart, and I think that we're at a time and a place where we have to have that greater resurrection of Christ consciousness around the planetary body through every faith. When we see pictures of Jesus in India, we see pictures of Jesus in Africa, we see Jesus in the Middle East. In fact, there was just recently a subway station in Tehran that was open, dedicated to Mother Mary and Jesus. And so I was looking at all these statues and paintings, and well, actually, they're engravings on the wall of Jesus and Mary in the center of Tehran. We see that the Saudi Arabian prince bought that Salvador del Mundi, the painting that was attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, the world savior. We see that in Saudi Arabia. We see different things happening where there is an awareness of the universality of Christ, and you don't have to necessarily become a Catholic or a an evangelical Christian or a Baptist, Southern Baptist to have Jesus in your life. And I think that's also a very important part of this book. So I believe I've covered most of it in a way. I don't know if I explained everything, but I hope this gives you and your listeners a wonderful desire to get more information and read for yourself what for me was an extraordinary journey into the true life and teaching of Jesus, and how it completely reinforces and makes alive the teachings of the Ascended Masters that we were given through Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and before that through the various dispensations that the Masters sponsored, that it is all one, and it's also one with the path of the saints of East and West. So that's a bit my message. I gave it all there pretty quick, but I hope it was helpful. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Uh, it's just incredible how much work you've done and in such quick time. 3 months is just incredible. My question is, how can the average person out there, how can we use this and what can we use it for? How can it help us?
Well, I think that it can help you become closer to Jesus from the perspective of understanding him as a person and as a deity. I also think that it will help you to understand how you can become your own Christ self as you follow in his footsteps and do the works that he did and greater, as he said, working with him. And so if you are a Christian or have been raised from the Christian faith, Catholic Christian faith, this brings a whole new dimension and understanding. And if you're somebody who's interested in the Eastern faiths and yoga and all of that, it brings Jesus right onto your yoga mat, So it's like no matter what path you come from, you can find Jesus in a way that will be relatable to you, because the truth the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The whole truth will set you free, and the whole truth is a spherical 360-degree circle. So there's room for everyone and for everyone, yes. And so I hope it brings people to having that love of Jesus as our Savior and as the one who will help us to ultimately bring our soul into Christ consciousness. We ultimately have to save ourselves. This is one thing that is important. This whole understanding of vicarious atonement, which means that Jesus died for our sins, therefore we can do whatever we want and we're saved if we just believe on his name, that is actually a false teaching. That is not what Jesus meant when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That is not what Jesus meant when he died for our sins, or when the apostles and St. Paul especially talk about him dying for our sins. He took on the karma of the world. He took on the karma at the time for the bringing in of the age of Pisces. But he said every jot and tittle has to be balanced. He said, he made different comments to the fact that we can't just lean upon him and expect him to do all of the work for us. We have to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, as they say. And I know people, for example, here I live in a Catholic university town, and there are kids who think, well, I can do whatever I want on Saturday night or Friday night, and then I go to church on Sunday and it's all good, right? And not just kids, grown-ups too. Or I do whatever I want, and then I go to confession and it's all erased because Jesus died for my sins. Well, that's just not the way it works. And I think this book makes it clear that we can't. That's not our path. Now, what the book also makes clear is, once again, this gift of the Aquarian age, which is the violet flame, which allows us, through our free will and vocation, through our determination and love, to invoke this spiritual energy that does transmute and consume negative karma, that will assist us in accelerating our path so that we can become more Christ-like. And that is our way, together with the body and blood of Jesus, to accelerate. And nevertheless, we have to take responsibility. It's really clear from this book and in general that we are sons and daughters of God. We are brothers and sisters of Jesus. He taught us, our Father who art in heaven, not my father, our Father. And so we have to have that responsibility that says, okay, I'm going to pick up my bed and walk, which Jesus said, pick up your bed and walk. When he would do healings, he would always say, do you want to be healed? Wilt thou be healed? And if the person said yes, then he would heal them if it was lawful for him to heal. Meaning he would take on a portion of that karma for a determined period of time to help the individual. But he didn't heal everyone. And he certainly didn't heal the Pharisees. He basically told them, they can still be blind. In fact, they took issue with that one time. They said, are you saying we're blind? And he was basically saying, the blind leading the blind. So we have to understand that we have a responsibility in our salvation, and that Jesus didn't just do it all for us by dying on the cross. That is not a true teaching. And we have to come up higher and work the works of him that sent us, to work our salvation, become what St. Paul speaks of when he talks about, our being sons of God. In fact, the book of Hebrew too also speaks about that, about how we are these sons of God, and we want to also be a part of the priesthood of Melchizedek. So anyway, I wanted to make that very clear, because that's where we depart from some of the more fundamental Christian awarenesses that like the idea that just because Jesus died, they're scot-free. There is no free ticket to heaven. It's a it's earned. Everything is earned. And the wayshowers have come to help us to understand how, and special dispensations have been given to make it a little easier. But we still have to prove our God mastery in the physical plane. We have to prove our Christ mastery. We have to earn our freedom from rebirth, which is also the path Gautama Buddha brought to us with the Eightfold Path.
I just want to share, thank you for that clarification. I want to share this is an alignment with all of what you just said. In my Bible, it's a New American Standard Bible. On page 1387, Galatians chapter 4, verse 19, Jesus speaks, "My children, with whom I am again in labor," like I'm working hard, "I'm in labor until Christ is formed in you."
That is such an important statement, until Christ is formed in us. And that's the path Jesus brought to us. And that is also the path for this age of Aquarius that I believe Elizabeth Clare Prophet and Mark Prophet brought to us as they were working hand in hand with Jesus on the inner planes as his messengers. And I remember one time Mother said to me, my job is to help you connect to Christ. And when you're connected to Christ, my job is done. Now, of course, I still love to hear her. And there are always new levels of Christhood that we can attain to. But this whole understanding that we are here to help each other become the Christ. The interesting story in the Bible happened with Jesus and Nicodemus, where Nicodemus wanted to understand how to, become a part of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus said, well, you have to be born again. And he was trying to understand. And he said, well, I can't go back into my mother's womb. And Jesus was basically explaining to him that there are people who are born again in the body, meaning they reincarnate, and then there are people who are born again in the spirit. And so to me, that passage not only points to the understanding of reincarnation that they had, but this idea that we can be born again in spirit. And that is, once you're born again, you still have to learn to walk in spirit. You still have to learn to talk in spirit. You still have to learn to, run and go to school in spirit, and eventually get all of your grades in spirit and have a master's degree in spirit and a doctor's degree and so forth. Anyway, and serve in spirit, world service in spirit on the etheric plane. So it's important, and this is what Jesus is coming to help us do, and this is what I believe Mark and Mother and the teachings of the Ascended Masters have come to help us to do.
Thank you. It's very rich work.
Yes, it is. It really is. And it's very transforming. Believe me, it is very transforming. And I have to say that it brought out parts of my not self-dweller at times. Let's just say that whatever was untransmuted in my being, and I'm not saying it's all gone, but let's just say elements of it were activated as I was working through this, because Jesus is he's the doctor of our souls. He's also the one who brings the fire, and he's also the one who, turns the tables over in the temple of our being. And when we welcome Jesus into our temple, we don't know what we're going to get. And sometimes it can really activate the parts of us that have not wanted to be in full congruency with Christ, or the parts of us that have aspects of rebellion that we brought forth from past lives, or as a child, or through social, programming and so forth. So it is a work that is sweet in the mouth and bitter in the belly, in the sense that as you partake of it, things will come up. And that's why it's important to give the violet flame and to keep praying to Jesus. I was praying to Jesus all the way through. Jesus, help me. Jesus, help me. so that this is as accurate as possible, as clear and clean as possible, and so that I become transformed with it also. Because to write this, I have to be able to become it and to be it. It's a transforming process, right? I mean, it's just like Peter saying to Jesus, "Thou art the Christ." He had to be the Christ. Or Mary Magdalene seeing Jesus coming out of the tomb. She had to have enough of her resurrected body activated to see his, perceive his. So it's still a work in progress. And I'm very, very thankful that I was given the job to do this. And I know that it was in my causal body to do. And I know that it was a part of my life mission and dharma to do. And I'm so glad I didn't shrink away after multiple promptings that this is going to be important for you to do. And it just seemed overwhelming to me, the amount of knowledge and the amount of everything, documents, the amount of everything that had to be processed to make this come together. But with God, all things are possible, and by God's grace and with a lot of angelic help, I was able to bring it into the world, and I'm very thankful for that opportunity, truly, for my soul too. And I hope it changes the world. I really hope it changes the world. I believe it will ultimately change the world because it is the word, and the word changes the world. So even if it takes a certain amount of time for people to really assimilate it and find it and so forth, it's out there now. And I could feel the incredible pressure and love of the Ascended Masters and eagerness of all of heaven to have this out. Like, oh my goodness, we've been waiting a long time for this. This story has not been set straight for 2,000 years. And thank God these ancient manuscripts were found. I mean, they had to bury them because they were afraid for their lives. And they didn't come out until almost 2,000 years later. All these things that were burned down, that were destroyed, that the church did everything they could to get rid of. And here they're back, and now they're in print. And so I even sent a copy of this to the Pope. So we'll see what happens. I said, please, if you would consider blessing this, I don't know if he may get it on the inner or on the outer, probably on the inner for sure, maybe on the outer. It's time for this to go forth into Christendom. And I'm also making it available for free because Jesus said, first of all, he said, if people try to make money off of his work, they'll be cursed. He actually said that even in the story of Elisha, that was an interesting story that I came across. Elisha had a servant who, now the name escapes me, but anyway, Elisha's servant was wanting to get payment for Elisha's miracles. Elisha healed a leper. And so his servant wanted to get payment for Elisha's healing. And so when the man who was healed, then said to Elisha, do you want anything? I can give you anything you want. He was a very wealthy, ruler of another land. Elisha said, no, I take nothing. And then his servant said, well, excuse me. He ran with his horse behind the man and said, it would be nice if we could have these clothes and this stuff and the goodies. And when he came back, Elisha knew what he was up to. And he said that his punishment, his atonement, he had to carry the leprosy now that had been healed off the other man. And that is because the karma came upon him. He did not have the ability, the attainment to lift this disease, this karma from the one that was healed. He didn't have that attainment, or it was not lawful for him to do it. So it was not lawful for him to receive payment for it. And because he wanted the payment for it, which was not his to receive, karmically, he had to carry the disease. Now, the book of Kings continues with, I believe he continued by Jesus, well, by Elisha's side anyway, because he comes back later. At first I thought, okay, is he gone now? But no, he comes back. So um, anyway, the point is that maybe eventually Jesus healed him too, or Elisha healed him too. I don't know, because he continued by Elisha's side. But it was a very important story because we see in that life the same principle that Jesus then brought forth again, not only in the New Testament, with the merchants in the temple and all of that, but we see it very much in the Gnostic Gospels, where he tells his apostles, you don't take payment. And even when he sends them out on the road, he says, did you lack anything? They said, no. You don't take payment. I mean, it was amazing. They go around and they find different places to stay, and different people provide food for them. It's a very alchemical walk with God. And Buddha had the same practice. Buddha did exactly the same thing with his disciples, was the same thing. And St. Francis. So we see again and again this journey where it's so different from the mega churches of today, where they're teaching all of this abundance spirituality, where you'll get rich if you make us rich, and that's not at all the teaching of Jesus. So I just wanted to bring that up as well, because I really learned that. And here I just have to see the name. I'm just going to look it up while I have you here. um Elisha's servant. I don't know why the name is out of my brain right now. Gehazi. I was going to say Gerati. Gehazi. So God bless Gehazi. He was very interesting. He reminds me of Jonah, who runs away because he doesn't want to preach to Nineveh, and then ends up going back to Nineveh anyway. It's interesting how some of these servants of God are almost humorous in their rebellion or their unwillingness to do the whole, to go the whole way. But ultimately they get corrected and fall in line, which is what happened to Thomas. I'll finish with this story of Thomas. So Thomas, this is in the Gnostic Gospels. Thomas, the apostles threw coins to see who would go where. Like, they divide up the world and they decide who goes where. It's going to be tossed. They toss coins for that, right? Fate would decide based on the coins. They did the same thing when they chose Matthias, who was the successor of Judas. They tossed coins, and that's how Matthias, was elected. And and he had actually given away all of his riches to follow Jesus. Um, then anyway, Thomas, it gets India, and he was like, there's no way I'm going to those savages. There's no way. And so he refuses. He's like, I'm not going to India. And so Jesus shows up in his resurrected body, and there happened to be I believe it was a captain of an Indian king who was there, who happened to be in Jerusalem, or in the Galilee at that time, looking for a carpenter. So Jesus appears to this man and he says, I hear you're looking for a carpenter. I just happen to have a slave over there that's a very good carpenter. And if you don't mind, I'll sell him to you. So, so the man literally buys Thomas from the resurrected Jesus to take him to India. And then Jesus says, now did you get the lesson? You're going to India, and I'll be with you, and you're taking nothing but your shirt and your sandals, and you're going. So that was very interesting to me, that story of how Jesus went and sold Thomas as a slave to this Indian person who was reporting back to the king, to one of the Indian kings, and that's how Thomas went off to India. So these are very funny little stories that we find, We find them again and again, and to me, they're very endearing. You know, I also love the story of it was time to pay taxes, and Peter goes up to Jesus. This was before the crucifixion, and he says, "Hey, you know, we got to pay taxes," and Jesus was like, "Well, you know, he gives them a teaching as to why they don't really have to pay taxes because they're sons of God, and you know, they're not slaves or whatever. And so he's basically saying we don't have to pay taxes. Nevertheless, he says, you know, we don't have to pay them from a spiritual standpoint. But he says, nevertheless, he says, you can go fishing, and the first fish you find, you open the mouth of the fish, and you will find a gold coin, and that will be to pay your taxes and mine." So Peter goes to the ocean and grabs the fish, and the first fish he finds has a gold coin in his mouth, and that's how, you know, Jesus precipitated that, and that's how the taxes were paid. So,
Wow.
so I thought that those were all very interesting little stories, right? Very
Yeah.
interesting stories that come up as we really go through these gospels, both the traditional gospels and the Gnostic gospels and the other apocryphal writings with a fine-tooth comb. We find so many very, very interesting learning experiences. So I hope that was all helpful and inspiring. I certainly was inspired and helped by it.
Yes, absolutely. I thank you very, very much. Um, Always a pleasure. You're always welcome back.
Thank you. Well, I'm working on another project, so I'll probably be back. So as long as as long as they keep me busy, I'm going to be busy because it's my joy. I have no greater joy than to do the labor of the Lord. You know, there's no greater joy for me at this point in my life. It's the only true joy of the everlasting gospel. So God bless you, Pamela, and thank you for having me.
God bless you too. Thank you.
Bye now.
Take care.